final portion of this program. Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Cronin. I'm the Asia-Pacific Security Chair here at Hudson Institute, and it was a real delight working with our Japan Chair, H.R. McMaster, Ben Gilman, who is the assistant to the Japan Chair, with Riho Aizawa, with Masashi Murano, and others here at Hudson to put on today's program. We've had just a fabulous list of speakers today, and really now they've shown us just how complex, how compressed, how competitive everything is in space, and how you develop space policy at this time is one of the most urgent matters for the U.S. government and for U.S. allies like Japan and partners like India. John Mencken started us off so well with the big question and really the thesis that everything we know in space is changing. And he knows a lot more about space than I do. So when he says that, that's a profound statement. And then we heard essentially testament to that from each one of the following speakers, just how much is changing. Peter Gerritsen, I think, calling very clearly for really new foundations, the quest for setting values and norms. General Quast essentially repeated this, that the first mover to space won't just be determining transportation, energy, manufacturing, and information, but really dominates and becomes preeminent economically, and because of that, militarily. We heard the importance from Dr. Goswami, Namrata Goswami, about the possibility of a vision with India, that this is something, a moment to be seized, the next stage of cooperation between the United States and India, just as we heard from Richard Lawless about the fact that Japan's new space plan is now a pivotal period for determining what Japan will do in space, and therefore what the United States and Japan can do in national security and in space. And so all of these speakers, and Murano-san here from Hudson, talking about how profoundly deterrence and deterrence concepts are going to be changing and affected by thinking about space. These are issues for our allies, but how you work with the private sector and the multitude of actors working in the private sector, how we work with our allies, how we cooperate where possible with competitors and rivals, but also how we compete with them, are critical questions of policy. So with that introduction, it is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mir Sadat, who is first and foremost a naval officer. We've talked a lot about how freedom of the seas and how much free seas is something like the challenge in space. Will it remain free or closed? So very important to have that background. His tours in Afghanistan, I mean, he has been in conflict zones in ways that space is not yet becoming quite a conflict zone, but certainly more contested and clashing values. But building foundations, thinking deterrence, these are issues he's thought of from the ground up. He's been a professor and an expert on Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and since the beginning of this year, he has been the director of defense policy and strategy at the National Security Council. General McMaster mentioned one of the things he was most proud of at the Hennessy was getting that space strategy codified by the Trump administration. And you are the man right now who is helping to shepherd that and herd all the cats here on space policy and strategy. So I hope I haven't built that up too much for you, Mir, but it is a great pleasure. Please welcome Dr. Mir Sadat.
Good morning or good afternoon. So the most controversial piece about this is not what you think it is. Is it going to be Captain Kirk or Colonel Kirk? All right. Will space officers like Army officers, Army generals and Air Force generals be issued guns in space? How will the uniform look like? Will it be a jumpsuit? What color? And what about the moniker of the service? And we know there are a couple of distinguished scholars among us who have talked about that and are leading the debate, a very fruitful debate, very useful debate. So let me extend a thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak with you. Hopefully, I will not rehash things we've already discussed. I've had the privilege of studying most of the people who've presented today, their works, General McMaster's works at the NSC. This perspective that I'm going to give to you is going to be primarily a security-focused lens, a lens that has informed the President of the United States on space for over 6 decades, even before the October 1957 Sputnik shock, the world's first artificial satellite launched by the Soviet Union. Back then, the Soviet Union was a major driver of post-World War II alignment. The United States and its allies faced a single conventional enemy during the Cold War, after which the United States led the effort to globalize the international order. America did not want a system disrupted by mainly the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and China. The thinking was if they're part of the system, they will not disrupt the so-called rules-based order. Then came the attacks of September 11th, 2001, and many of us in uniform and civilians have had first-hand encounters either here or in overseas contingency operations dealing with them. That shifted the entire momentum of the 1990s push. It brought a new era of global security posture for the international community and also for global governance. This period of uncertainty that was not caused by the hands of a state actor like Russia or China, but it was a nefarious non-state actor with global potential, Al-Qaeda. Very soon, we also saw the effects of the 19th push for the interconnected global market coming to an end with the financial crisis of 2007, a time when our 401ks dwindled, our home prices plummeted, and unemployment surged to almost 10%. Since then, the prospect of bringing Russia or China into the so-called world order, in which we were the most powerful player, has diminished. Global outsourcing and liberalization efforts backfired and resulted in unintended consequences. Globalization led to a loss of expertise in production of U.S. industrial goods, fueled the growth of counterfeiting of parts and components in many industries, and even resulted in the compromise of sophisticated technologies and sensitive information, not just for the United States, but for many of our allies. In the defense industry, counterfeit parts affect the safety, operational readiness, and critical nature of the U.S. military, especially as we continue to track and target violent jihadist terrorists. As we've now focused more on existential threats, our foreign policy and export control communities today have heightened concerns about the U.S. supply chain integrity, the theft of American innovation, and want to mitigate vulnerabilities in our technology, service, and critical infrastructures. The United States still advocates for a global marketplace that embraces fair and open competition, free trade, and respects intellectual property rights. Our nation's free and open trade needs protection from threats undermining our strategic leadership role in the global marketplace and our dominance across the shared domains. As thus, during the last few years, these threats are addressed within the context of great power competition and national security strategy that my organization published in 2017 under General McMaster's leadership. When discussing great power competition, of course, we tend to focus on China and the disputes of the Indo-Pacific, such as the South China Sea. We also think about Russia, Europe, Eurasia, and the fragmented fault lines across sections of the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, where great powers converge. But nowhere is great power competition as ambiguous and nebulous than in space. Great power competition in space is in some ways analogous to the great game of the 19th and 20th centuries between Great Britain and Russia, which competed over access to resources and geostrategic positioning in Central and South Asia. Today, there's a similar great game brewing between China and other spacefaring nations led by the United States over access to potential cislunar resources and overall space dominance. This has major implications for our modern way of living, our national economic well-being, and the security of our nation and our allies. Currently, our space systems provide strategic and tactical warning of impending threats, monitor the agricultural and industrial base, secure timely financial transactions, give trustworthy positioning, navigation, timing, and weather forecasts. And of course, assured communications across all lines of efforts. Just imagine, in comparison to the 9/11 attacks or the market crash of 2007, what the magnitude of degradation, disruption, destruction of our overhead space-derived capabilities will have on our societies. Not surprisingly, the 2017 National Security Strategy says the United States considered considers unfettered access to and freedom to operate in space to be a vital interest. I interpret vital interest something for which you're going to fight for. The national security strategy further elaborates that any harmful interference with or attack upon critical components of our space architecture that directly affects vital U.S. interests will be met with a deliberate response at any time, any place, any manner, and in a domain of our choosing, whether land, air, sea, cyber, or space. The national security strategy calls for advancing space as a priority. With respect to space now, what does this mean for us in the National Security Council? Besides having to run last minute to the building here, for being late in another meeting. So we in the National Security Defense Directorate and our peers, the newly reestablished National Space Council, hold coordination meetings and working groups to address current and future opportunities as well as challenges to our national security, commercial, and civil space lines of effort. So 3 different effort lines. In fact, a surgical rewrite of the 2010 National Space Policy has started through issuance of various SPDs, EOs, and NSPMs, basically presidential memorandum. Our space policy will not only catch us up to the realities of today. So 2010, when the president last signed it, was probably written sometime in 2008, and in coordination for about a year, right? So it's almost a decade plus old. So this national space policy that we will promulgate will not only catch us up to the realities of today's, but to the imaginative realm of future, tomorrow. 2 months ago, U.S. Space Command was resurrected as a combatant command. We now look to the Hill to authorize the creation and funding of a new military branch, the United States Space Force. Space Command and Space Force are 2 different things that are sometimes confused, but they are complementary and dependent initiatives. Space Command will focus on joint warfighting operations in space, manned by assigned Navy, Army, Air Force, Marine, military, and civilian personnel, who will support the command with their terrestrial-focused capabilities. Therefore, without a unique Space Force focused primarily on space, there will be no one solely dedicated, responsible, or accountable to recruit, train, develop doctrine, or equip the nation's space warriors. The United States cannot wait for another 9/11 in space. And we definitely cannot wait for perhaps a full-on Pearl Harbor style attack on American satellite constellations to convince our U.S. decision makers that it is time to create a space force. That would be akin to waiting on World War II to convince leaders to build the U.S. Air Force, which was finally built in 1947. Due to the Air Force's amazing success, no ground troops have been killed by enemy manned aircraft attacks since the end of the Korean War in 1953. How many troops were lost in World War II because we focused on familiar land and sea domains and turned a blind eye to emerging threats and opportunities in space? Consider that it may have been better to have built the Air Force in 1927 or any other time prior to the beginning of World War II rather than 1947. How many troops, civilians, and satellite assets will we lose if we in 2019 delay the creation of a service to think about space warfare until the next war? And therefore, the United States cannot afford to fight a World War II-style conflict knowing that the operational battle space has exponentially expanded to include space. Although our space systems support the terrestrial forces, actions in space also affect our future conflicts here on Earth. Any opponent who controls space may hold our population centers and our deployed forces, Navy guy, at risk without ever taking a terrestrial action. In this new era of multi-domain warfare, our competitive margin of dominance is shrinking, primarily because the bipolar environment upon which America's space enterprise was constructed, the Cold War strategic environment, no longer exists. And so the United States prefers space to remain free from conflict, but China and Russia have actively exhibited warfare capabilities in space. The United States is merely rebuilding a set of capabilities that have atrophied over decades to strategically compete in the face of even more capable rivals. For many years, states from Russia and China to North Korea and Iran have pursued weapons to jam, blind, disable our navigation and communication satellites via electronic attacks from the ground. China and Russia have both conducted highly sophisticated on-orbit activities that could enable them to maneuver their satellites into close proximity with ours, posing unprecedented new dangers to our space systems. In particular, these experiments entail orbital maneuvering of military spacecraft. Moreover, Chinese academics and foreign policy leaders have written an avalanche of papers going back to 2005 advocating for the placement of laser weapons in space. China and also Russia have developed, tested, and fielded counterspace capabilities to deny the US, its allies, and partners, and the commercial sector the use of space-based systems during crisis and conflict. China will ultimately not only deploy laser weapons on the ground, but perhaps even in space. Russia has mirrored China's development of counterspace capabilities. I encourage you to consult the recently released DIA and NASIC space threat reports for more details on this. Particularly to the Indo-Pacific, the multiple threats include Chinese space activities and their behavior in the South China Sea, the increased air and naval activity in and around Japan by Russia and China, North Korea's continued ballistic missile threat, and the growing anti-satellite ASAT capabilities of other states. By no means will India be the last nation to test an ASAT. Expect more in the future. This will likely increase the chance of mishap in space, and therefore precautionary requirements are perhaps needed. To put that in perspective, in 2007, when China conducted a kinetic ASAT test on its dead weather satellite, it created a debris field of almost 3,400 pieces, more than half of which are expected to be still in orbit by 2027. So you see, the assumption that space would have remained a sanctuary or uncontested is no longer valid. The United States and its allies do not necessarily have dominance over space. No amount of wishful thinking can make our adversaries, their capabilities, the evolving space environment, or our shortcomings go away. Of course, military strength in any domain should be avoided through soft power such as diplomacy and the deterrence of hard power by making any attacks undesirable and costly. Nonetheless, history tends to be cyclical. Maybe space too, right, if you keep on going. We can either prepare in posture or do the right thing, or we can be unprepared when faced by conflict. So with each passing day, great power competition across all domains becomes even more the norm, and potential adversaries become more competent and capable in space. Like any land or maritime conflict, America will never go to war without its allies, and this is especially true in space. In space, we may partner with, protect, and inform our allies, be they governments or organizations. In fact, in the civilian and commercial sector, we can think about satellites as being hostile, friendly, or non-combatants in a potential battle space. Recently, my colleague, Dr. Scott Pace, speaking at the 70th International Astronautical Congress, explained that the United States promotes common values shared by international partners, protect U.S. national interests, and enable commercial sector leadership and growth in space. If humanity is to have a future in space, it should be a future in which space is home of peoples and nations that share at least and respect similar values for rule of law, democracy, economic freedom, and human rights. Those common values have evolved across the air, land, and sea domains in which we have operated with partners, forging unique capabilities, authorities, and talents to bear down on shared common threats. These values will inform the shared acceptable norms and behavior, ensuring freedom of access and use of space, which China and Russia are challenging across all shared domains today. And the nations of the Indo-Pacific region are neither exempt or isolated from this trend. While space is not subject to claims of sovereignty or direct control like the other physical domains, we need to ensure that the rules governing space are created by responsible spacefaring nations who share our values. That is why our partnerships are going to be a key element of our success in this era of great power competition. For example, Space Command has over 100 space situational awareness agreements. About 80 are with commercial companies. There are about 22 with nations around the world. In addition, we hold the Shriva War Games, which studies how future conflict extends into space. Shriva War Games exhibits the growing security cooperations with the Five Eyes partners, France and Germany and Japan. The need to share space intelligence, operations, and technology will drive a review of space classifications that may likely increase space technology transfers, coalition exercises, and partnerships in space. There may be also potential opportunities in future years, especially for partnerships with Indo-Pacific regional players on furthering space situational and maritime domain awareness, using both space and terrestrially based assets. Opportunities also exist for international cooperations in space debris mitigation, operating standards, and effective lines of communications for orbital operations. These are great potential opportunities for Indo-Pacific nations such as Japan, Australia, and India. And of course, these partnerships are even more likely to happen in our civil space sector as we look to send humans to deep space again. First to the moon and then on to Mars. In fact, NASA is seeking partnerships with US industry and international partners for the nascent Artemis lunar project. The moon has never been more within reach. I'm from Southern California, as the general knows. 3-day commute by car, it's a 3-day commute to the moon from Earth. So probably safer. After we land the first American woman and next American man near the south pole of the moon, which is 25% larger than the surface of the African continent, the plan is to create a sustainable lunar presence to include a crew rendezvous point, science laboratory, and propellant depot at the NASA Gateway in high lunar orbit and lunar surface operations that will inform humanity's destination to Mars. For this journey, there may be potential to make use of lunar minerals, metals, and water resources. Without going into the technical or project specifics, this effort represents tremendous partnerships and opportunities for the Indo-Pacific spacefaring nations. To put this in perspective, economic impact estimates project that the US space economy will grow between 3 to 8-fold over the next few decades, an approximately $2.7 trillion space economy. American efforts in the commercialization of space are vital. I explain to you what vital means to our national interest because it reflects US security investments in space. The future space operating environment is expected to be exponentially more voluminous and diverse. Emerging commercial ventures such as satellite servicing, debris removal, in-space manufacturing, tourism, and cutting-edge technologies enabling small sat and expansive satellite constellations are outpacing efforts to develop and implement government policies and processes to address these new activities. As new space actors and capabilities emerge, there will be a need for more work on the implementation of principles guided by the Outer Space Treaty and related guidelines in order to avoid risking the stability and security of the outer space environment. On the other hand, the Chinese are actively working to undermine any such efforts and have laid out a 30-year cislunar economic plan that will supposedly generate $10 trillion by 2050, 3 times the size of our estimated economy. If true, we must create a collaborative, conscientious setting in which other nations choose to align themselves and their space activities with us, the United States, as opposed to those without any regard to the space operating environment. We need to think about space before we lose space. Right now, we have the competitive advantage, but that advantage is rapidly eroding as peer and near-peer competitors ascend to space without any regard for space, as they are aided by advanced technologies which they might have stolen from others. A recent Air Force Futures report claimed that by 2060, space will be a significant engine of national, political, economic, and military power, and that the United States must commit to having a military force structure that can defend this international space order and defend American space interests, to include American space settlements and commerce. It will be the U.S. Space Force which will provide the necessary expertise for the U.S. Space Command to ensure unfettered access to and the freedom to operate within space. U.S. Space Command will provide vital effects and capabilities to joint and coalition partners during peacetime and across the spectrum of conflict, just as the U.S. Navy, a little pitch for my Navy, right? Just as the U.S. Navy stands the watch to ensure that we freely navigate the world's seas, such as those in the Indo-Pacific. America must now ensure the freedom to navigate through space. If we continue to delay the creation of a U.S. Space Force until it is too late, we jeopardize the comforts of our American life, the lifeline of our economy, the enabling of our national security assets, and the execution of priorities, especially in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere around the world. Let me conclude I see no sleeping heads here, which is good. Let me conclude by drawing your attention to the start of my talk. While the Cold War is over, great power competition is back, and the great game ensues for cislunar leadership. Spacefaring nations need to decide whether they want to be part of the same routine, boring thing in space, stranded on a Chinese space station, or do they want to do something, I'm talking as if I'm talking to kids, right? Like get them all energized, or they want to do something that's spectacular, amazing, exciting, and explore the moon and Mars with us, the United States. It would be nice to see one of our Indo-Pacific partners be the first Asian to walk on the moon. America has always been ready for a challenge, a good challenge, a tough challenge. We are natural explorers and innovators. We create, we don't steal. We have an American entrepreneurial spirit, scientific curiosity, a strong sense of patriotism, and a belief in teamwork, which are the right ingredients for success in space. But to achieve this, the government's vision, our scientific community's rigor, inspiring entrepreneurs with cool rockets, and our allies' comparative advantages must all synchronize. To win the great game in space, we must ensure our economy, innovative technology, and national security are a priority. Thank you.